There's a great problem in the West. Our leaders don't seem to be in control. We're seeing a rise in foreign wars and tragic imagery, and yet more worrying signs of threats on the horizon. The world feels as though it's descending into a period of ever more violence, and we're not ready. The relative stability of the past 3 decades hasn't prepared us for this. But for all the news we read, hardly anybody pays attention to what foreign leaders actually say, other than in extremely filtered form through our traditional media, which these days often isn't faithful to the sentiment of what's being said. We don't hear from them. Contrast this with the 1960s and John F. Kennedy's ambassador to Japan, Edwin Reischauer, making important cultural documentaries to help Americans better understand Japan and the Japanese way of viewing the world. Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone later went on to say of Reischauer, "I know of no other man who has so thoroughly understood Japan." Fast forward to February 2023, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, gave a 5-hour interview in which he discussed at length his personal attempts at mediating a peace agreement directly between Zelensky and Putin in March 2022. This draft agreement got as far as draft 18.
We got to draft 17, 18. Here, it really was on the highest level. I don't accept the cynicism towards the strategy. What odds did you give it? 50%.
In the West, we heard almost nothing about it. The Chinese Communist Party puts out a fortnightly journal called Quixi, which translates as Seeking Truth. To use the words of Dan Wang, a technology analyst who put this on my radar, it spells out the evolving idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Quixi reads like a cross between The New Yorker and the Federal Register. Published twice a month, the magazine features lengthy essays, thick pages, and some of the finest writers in the party. Each issue starts in the same way, a reprint of a speech or essay by Xi Jinping, in a font distinct from the rest of the magazine, and then commentary and reports from the rest of the party state. All of this is translated into an English language version and is available online. Clearly, much of this is propaganda, of course, but it does teach you things, and we in the West would be wise to look at it. If you are watching this video, I will take it as given that you are a relatively well-informed, news-reading citizen of the West. Did you even know that such a journal exists? And Vladimir Putin, believe it or not, regularly gives long fireside discussions, which are even voice-overed in English, but get no Western press attention at all.
Why is the State Secretary making such announcements on behalf of Ukraine? Well, you should ask him. As far as the negotiating process is concerned, if the US believes that Ukraine is ready to engage in talks, then Ukraine needs to lift the presidential decree that prevents Ukraine from engaging in talks. There is a presidential decree, and by that decree he banned himself and all the rest from entering into talks.
Cooling relations between countries, which stems from a lack of listening to one another, is becoming a very serious global problem. As recently movingly noted by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, without global cooperation, all the other things we in the West might worry about are not going to get resolved. Sustainable development cannot work in the context of war. Whatever your thing, climate targets, AI safety, global preparedness for the next pandemic, these initiatives go out of the window if diplomatic tensions cannot be reconciled. We are not going to succeed in any of our shared objectives in a deeply divided world, much less a world in open war. To achieve anything at a global scale, we need cooperation. A relative degree of peace is key to sustainable development. Little else matters if this is not gotten right. I personally feel that we thus need a new Council on Foreign Relations. A Council on Foreign Relations for a multipolar world, if you will. The management of USA Inc. and by extension Team the West the past 30 years has been wanting. I am 31 years old. I am allowed to say this. Perhaps there's a degree to which this is cyclical, and there has been a guiding hand of history that's encouraged the state of global affairs we find ourselves in today. But judged simply by debt levels, generation post-Cold War has done a subpar job of steering the ship. My generation ought to be displeased, to put it politely. Looking back to the early 1990s and the hand the West had then, there is no reason why today we should be being bequeathed a world descending into increasing instability and monetary woes. This is the product of bad management, and in international relations, a severe atrophying of diplomatic ability that did exist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. To illustrate the severity of decline, on a recent Foreign Affairs podcast, we had the present-serving US ambassador to China publicly bragging that he is spending his days trying to subvert another regime.
We're trying to reach out to the Chinese people. A couple days later, we tried to sneak it back onto Weibo. It was taken down in 20 minutes. So we're trying to engage the Chinese people And I don't think, in 2022, you can have an effective American embassy anywhere in the world if you're not speaking to the people of the country where you're living.
Instead of actually trying to understand the other side and build bridges, as Edwin Reischauer, his diplomatic predecessor, would have done, Japan in the 1960s being the rising power of intimidation in Asia, and continuing what has been the function of an ambassador for centuries, Burns calls this a new kind of diplomacy.
We're trying to get out to tell America's story. I think that's a big part of diplomacy, very different from the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, very different from the past 4 or 5 decades. This is absolutely part of diplomacy now, and I don't think there's any going back on that.
I would like us to go back to the old form, revamped for the 21st century. To enable this to happen, we need new institutions. Those who have presided over the US-led establishment since the fall of the Berlin Wall have professed themselves to being too US-centric.
So Foreign Affairs is a global publication. We strive to present authoritative analysis by experts from all over the world. But we are an American publication. We're based here in New York, which is where I am today. Most of our staff are Americans, as our plurality, I think, of our contributors. And because the United States and its role in the world are extremely important topics in international relations, we focus on them a lot. What that means is that we constantly have to force ourselves to think outside this sort of US-centric bubble that we are in, and make sure that we are attuned to how things look from elsewhere, especially from countries that are not part of the so-called West or the global North. And we can talk about those terms later in this discussion. This is important, especially now, because I think during the past year and a half, anyone who's spent time in a Western capital, whether it's Washington or Brussels or places like New York, is aware that people in the United States and Western countries have been kind of swept up in this narrative of unity, inspired mostly by the way that America and its allies in Europe and in East Asia have banded together in support of Ukraine. Also in the background is this contest, this US-Chinese contest, which has become more freighted in recent years. Elsewhere, though, it really is a different story. And if you spend the time outside of the West or the global North, you really can feel that. But when you do, what you find is that this narrative of unity, it seems to many people outside the West, I think at best naive, and at worst, phony and hypocritical. The way that the war in Ukraine and the US-China competition and the international system look from Africa or Latin America or South Asia or Southeast Asia, they matter a lot. And not just because in order to understand the world, it's inherently important to understand how most of the world's people see it. But it also matters for a kind of more practical or pragmatic reason if you're a Western policymaker or scholar. Without buy-in from the so-called global South, this whole issue of unity around the liberal international order or around democratic principles, this story really is very little more than a fairy tale.
Though the clip I just played was from a discussion that valiantly attempted, in part, to correct this problem, at large, we in the West are not listening to other parts of the world. This, I assert, is a product of hubris. We like to talk about globalization, but if you actually study foreign media for a few months, you begin to discern that there is in fact a kind of invisible media firewall between our Western press and the rest of the world. When the second longest serving foreign minister in Turkey's history, speaking 4 days after the Bucha massacre in Ukraine became public, the stated reason for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia collapsing in April 2022, says the following in perfect English.
We are still hopeful and cautiously optimistic. At the same time, we are realistic. There are difficult issues, but we have to continue our efforts. And as Turkey, we are doing our best. Both sides agreed that 2 presidents also could come together.
Why has he never once been interviewed by Western press to discern what happened from a Turkish perspective? When a former Israeli prime minister gives a very detailed account of negotiating directly between Zelensky and Putin at the outset of Russia's invasion, why do we also hear nothing about it? And a small detail, but on the rare occasion when Western commentators do mention the likes of Naftali Bennett and former Minister Cavusoglu on X or Twitter, they do so almost always without mentioning them, as if they're aliens on another planet. It's true that both of their feeds are primarily in their native languages, but they both have X accounts with very sizable followings, and they both speak perfect English. These are neutral countries bordering on strong allies. Turkey is a NATO member, and Israel gets immense military backing from the United States. Naftali Bennett's parents even immigrated to Israel from America. The opinions of foreign leaders are not covered well at all in the West. And as I've learned from people who are older and wiser than me, the United Nations seems to have largely faded from mainstream relevance as a form for non-Western leaders to be heard. I'd just like to note, I have huge respect and admiration for the present editor of Foreign Affairs. His book on George Marshall and the Chinese Civil War is sublime. I've done 2 very detailed write-ups of it. I learned a huge amount from it. But the institution of the Council on Foreign Relations, which backs foreign affairs, is self-admittedly too US-centric, as we have heard. They have roughly 5,000 expert-level members, most of whom are based in the US. And when they conduct polling to get expert opinion, even after their non-aligned world issue that the clip I shared was from, they do so from academics residing overwhelmingly in the United States. Foreign Affairs can constantly force itself to think outside of its US-centric bubble, to use the words of its own executive editor, but there's no way the Council on Foreign Relations is going to be able to pivot sufficiently to capture the reality of the new multipolar world we are likely now heading into. Substack is great, and X under Elon is a sizable corrective to this, for sure. But they're also both focused on the new. The weight of their attention is on breaking news and new writing. And neither are naturally structured to compound historical knowledge over time in the way, say, of a Wikipedia. On X, it's easy for things that happened as recently as 18 months ago to get forgotten and lost, or memory hold, to take the phrase from Orwell's 1984, meaning people turning on a dime and entirely changing what they've said as if to imply they've been saying that new thing all along. This isn't just trivial Twitter intellectual dishonesty. Even the most senior leaders in the West are prone to a kind of democratic amnesia. We in the United Kingdom have had 3 different prime ministers just since Russia's February 2022 campaign into Ukraine. And we've had a huge amount of turnover, both in political figures and in civil servants in that time. People at the top of government are quite conceivably not briefed on what actually happened at the outset. I have worked in 10 Downing Street. I say this with some insider perspective. We need a remedy for this, built from first principles. I would like to propose a new institution called Listening to the Other Side. Here are some of the principles I consider it should adhere to. 1. We need a new architecture for information that accumulates institutional memory. Not to be school children playing soccer, meaning everybody running after the shiny new ball. Rather, structure and designated positions, consistency on the most pressing conflicts, not chasing daily what's deemed to be newsworthy. 2. Writing should be assembled for practical people, for decision makers. Feature-style writing is not optimally helpful to decision makers. Bullet points should be encouraged. Articles should not be 10,000 words. Information should get to the point. It should lead with its conclusion up front and be digestible consumption for somebody in the melee of beginning in a new administration, not to add to one's reading pile and have them feel yet further behind. 3. There should be no print product. Digital only. This is because most print publications, lovely as they are really a hangover from being a once effective conduit to sell advertising. This, of course, isn't working so well for most anymore, and print publications continue out of tradition and obligation rather than from any capitalist incentive. But their incentive from inception remains. The only reason to write at such length is to sell more advertising space, and a magazine of sufficient weight to charge a premium. This begets the publication of continual new information, and it propels a flywheel of overwhelm for readers. Right now in magazines, the stuff in the latest issue is often not built on top of prior issues. It's often just new stuff and different opinions. It's no wiser than the prior issues. And quite often, the stuff of wisdom 6 issues back gets entirely forgotten and drowned out. There are no pinned comments in magazines. And of course, books can't be written and published quickly enough to deal with the rapidity of our now changing landscape. An ideal new structure would be a core-stated and broadly agreed history for a global issue that's pinned atop a website and doesn't move. This to be continually updated and gradually added to as events unfold, and more information comes to light to ever further correct it. Have readers critique this and crowdsource feedback. Below this pinned history, have articles branching off of the core chronology that explore and analyze new information and opinion-based assertions as to what to do about it. So much in magazines and newspapers today is rehashing and often bastardizing what should be in a pinned Wikipedia-like chronology that a majority of people broadly agree on. The focal point of a site that's actually built for decision makers should not be continual new reporting. It should be a series of world-leading chronologies on the most important issues that continually get updated and refined. You would further then integrate a search box for a large language model focused on and to be able to query just the material from these chronologies at lightning speed. The website should not be optimized to maximize visitors to the site, nor visitor time on the site, nor page views for any article, nor YouTube likes, nor podcast ratings, nor magazine subscribers. It should be optimized for bringing incisive clarity to decision makers. Drawing inspiration from Professor Graham Allison, founding dean at Harvard's Belfer Center, articles should further offer a solution menu, what are all of the conceivable ways this thorny problem could be remedied, and where possible, a recommendation. All of this to be independent from government, done with minimal ideological bias. Authors should be named, not anonymous like The Economist or Time magazine as it was originally conceived. Ideally, there should be no paywall or subscription. By and large, it should make minimal claim of original thinking. It should rather aggregate the web, Western and foreign sources, and give an extremely organized synthesis of primary source information with due hyperlinked attribution. It should aim to guide policymakers to be less foolish. This would be a worthwhile aim. It needs to do all of this while aspiring to build the authority and prestige of a Council on Foreign Relations, which, of course, takes decades of superlative insight and world-class scholarship to build. From a great number of biographies I've read, I consider there are broadly 4 steps to achieving effective diplomacy. 1. Discern reality. Listen to both sides and ascertain as close to the ground truth of what's happened as possible. 2. Speak truth to power. Do away with false accounts and self-deceptions on both sides. Get as close an agreed account of reality with all parties as is possible. 3. List an exhaustive menu of options for conceivable paths that could be taken forward. I should note, this is basic groundwork not done by the majority of our present media. And only then, 4, get leaders of countries who are in conflict to try and agree to a workable solution. This is what a State Department or Foreign Office should be doing, but today are not. I would also note from my personal reading, a country's foreign policy is typically far more emotional or personal in respect of the country's leader than almost any analyst gives credit in real time. In biographies, you will readily observe that strategies change by mood and temperament on a near daily basis. With respect to the present, I'm sure one could reasonably infer that it's likely there are days where Xi Jinping wakes up and thinks, let's go now, in respect of invading Taiwan, and others where he thinks it's near impossible. This would be historically normal. I've been at the heart of government during the crisis in COVID in 2020. I can report firsthand, leaders indeed change their minds, sometimes multiple times a day. This is captured in biography and comparative history like Professor Graham Allison's brilliant Destined for War, but it's almost never captured in real-time forward-looking geopolitical analysis because so few people are paying close enough attention. A few last principles. This outlet should not be trying to win debates or cause verbal slip-ups from perceived opponents. Rather, it should earnestly try and refine the accuracy of determining what's happened and improve the menu of plausible creative solutions, ultimately advocating for its best solutions such that they're taken up by decision makers. Not debate, but dialectic. Not win an argument, but arrive at the best outcome. Some diplomacy ends in compromise, but in opposing sides being frank and actually listening to one another, and even being open-minded to acknowledging where they might be wrong. Occasionally, there are creative, unforeseen third ways to achieve an outcome that aren't merely either side making trade-offs. In the middle of two strongly held views, there is sometimes a creative third route. This type of thinking was on display from Jared Kushner in his and his team's forensic study to determine an accurate historical chronology of the Middle East and putting together the 2020 Abraham Accords.
We started just researching what had been done before us, and what I did in the first year was I just tried to understand everyone's perspective on the files. So my biggest deficit was that I didn't have any diplomatic experience, but my biggest advantage was that I didn't have any diplomatic experience. So I came in, and I give one example in here where I'm meeting with the ruler of the UAE, who's thought to be the most strategic thinker in the region. He's somebody who's been there a while. He just became the president of the country, and he's a guy, Mohammed bin Zayed, who's really a giant. And I'm meeting with him after about 6 months, and I take him through some of the thoughts as to how I want to approach it. And I really was asking him a ton of questions. And he says, I think you're going to make peace here. So why do you say that? He says, well, the US usually sends one of 3 types of people to see me. The first types are people who come and fall asleep in meetings. He says the second are people who come and they basically read me talking points and have no ability to have a conversation. The third are senior level people who come and basically try to convince me to do things that are against my interests. Mm-hmm. He says, you're the first person who's ever come to see me from the US who's asking questions. And my fundamental question was very simple, which is the US has a ton of power. What would you do if you were us, right? Like, what's the end state that's achievable here? And what levers would you play with if you were us in order to try to achieve that end state? And it took him a couple times of me asking that question to actually understand that I was seeking like an honest feedback on the question. Mm. But that was how I started with everyone, trying to understand, get their point of view on what needed to be done.
From Jared's book, he noted on putting together the Abraham Accords. As I talked to foreign policy luminaries to get their perspectives, I met with Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a heavyweight among the foreign policy establishment. I described the general approach I planned to pursue and then asked if he thought it had any chance at success. Nope, he said. I asked him why he was so sure. Simple, he replied. No one has made money betting on success in the Middle East over the last 25 years. Haas was so dismissive that I began to realise how defeatist the foreign policy establishment had become. As I read books that past negotiators had written on the subject, I noticed a familiar refrain. They all explained that it wasn't that they had failed, but that the problem was too hard. Irrespective of who goes on to occupy the White House at any point in the future, we should be encouraging more Jared-like diplomacy. We should listen directly to foreign leaders, even, or perhaps especially, ones who are at war with our allies. Ceasing dialogue helps nobody. In the reverse of everything I'm saying about cooperation, this is how we stop madmen. Here's Ryan Holiday writing on the outbreak of World War II. Churchill was likely one of the only British leaders to take the time to sit through and digest Hitler's Mein Kampf. If Chamberlain had, perhaps Hitler could have been stopped sooner. Thus, we need to actually listen to foreign leaders. To provide a further historical success story of such thinking, Edwin Reischauer was appointed US ambassador to Japan by President John F. Kennedy in the spring of 1961, at a time when US-Japan relations were at a low point following the massive 1960 protests in Japan against the US-Japan Security Treaty. In the immediate aftermath of the protests, Reischauer had travelled to Japan and spoken with various Japanese friends and associates to get a Japanese point of view on the protests. After returning to the United States, Reischauer attracted the attention of Kennedy's transition team when he wrote an article about the protests in the prominent policy journal Foreign Affairs, called The Broken Dialogue with Japan. In this article, Reischauer rejected the notion put forth by the Eisenhower administration that the protests had been a communist plot. Instead, he argued that the protests reflected real grievances on the part of the Japanese in relation to the US, and were exacerbated by a failure of American leaders to reach out to Japanese opinion leaders and try to understand Japanese concerns. Reischauer argued forcefully that only skilled and nuanced diplomacy could repair this broken dialogue. Reischauer, being appointed by JFK, was able to greatly improve dialogue between the two countries at a very fraught moment. This was while navigating the extremely precarious years of the Vietnam War, which the Japanese, throughout the 1960s, understandably feared could escalate throughout Asia, and that they, housing so many US military bases, could become a target. Reischauer noted of his approach. It was not so much to persuade the Japanese to agree to American points of view as to broaden the area of discourse in order to find points of common understanding and to seek out differences in underlying assumptions that brought us to contrasting conclusions. I sought to shift the emphasis from the Japanese assumption that our relationship is one of a leader-follower, in which Japan is only free to choose its degree of alignment with American policy, to a sense of partnership, in which Japan and the United States, as the two great industrialized nations of the Pacific, face together the problems of that area on the basis of our respective but actually closely parallel interests and ideals. 7 years on from his first article, in 1967, writing again in Foreign Affairs, having served his time as ambassador to Japan, Reischauer noted, "At the time that my resignation was announced last July, every major Japanese newspaper, remembering the earlier talk of our broken dialogue with Japan, took the occasion to comment editorially that the dialogue between the United States and Japan was now a frank and equal one. As I've said already, in 1985, on the opening of the Edwin Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, part of Johns Hopkins University, Japan's then ambassador read a personal message from Japan's then Prime Minister. I know of no other man who has so thoroughly understood Japan. A new editorial institution should be founded, making a humble attempt at reviving Reischauerian spirit, offering a gold standard for facts and such perspective as I've just outlined that can be accessed quickly and reliably. Now, why should I be the person to propose and potentially help found such a new institution? I'm not a foreign policy expert. I make no claim to be. But having just turned 31 years old, I have a rather odd combination of having co-founded a successful, entirely bootstrapped publishing company at age 24 that's gone on to be very profitable and was part acquired in 2020. I've worked at the heart of British government in 10 Downing Street. And working with the Prime Minister's then chief advisor, I have plausibly spent more time sat around the cabinet room table observing decision makers than almost anyone alive my age or younger. I've seen what kinds of briefs are helpful to decision makers and which are not. I have some training in journalism. The editor of The Spectator has kindly said of me, Edward is one of the most influential interns ever taken on via The Spectator's CV blind scheme. This was in 2016, and it was following my leaving school age 17, despite being an A student, to pursue entrepreneurship. Internships with The Spectator are more competitive per place than either Harvard or Oxford. I have a very deep interest in geopolitics. Going back to 2019, while running my startup, in evenings and weekends, I was doing things like entering contests run by Professor Graham Allison to propose grand strategies for US-China tensions outlined in Professor Allison's book. And I've read a huge number of biographies of founders of now legacy media institutions. Here are some of my favorites. Henry Luce and Time magazine. And Henry Luce, incidentally, first coined the term the American century in 1941. Bennett Cerf and Random House. Harold Ross and The New Yorker, and Irving Thalberg and MGM. A great number of prestige media institutions today were founded roughly 100 years ago by people in their mid-20s and early 30s who were far from world-leading authorities in what they were publishing. And should anyone wish to study the quality of my journalism, I will link to a video chronology that I've put together on Ukraine and Russia 2022 peace negotiations. Professor John Mearsheimer said of it, "This is excellent. I actually learned a lot." The Spectator's Russia correspondent noted, "Your video is far better sourced and footnoted than more or less anything I have seen on the subject, or indeed on Ukraine in general. A very thorough piece of work." And Jared Kushner wrote to me on my summary of his book, "You did a better job summarizing it than I would have done. I thus consider that I'm well placed to do this." And I'll give you one last reason. I'm not American. I have an immense affinity for America. I've spent a great deal of time there. 2 companies I've co-founded are US based. And thus, whilst I do not reside there, I have the joy of paying US federal taxes. But while in many ways adoring America, I recognize that there's a worldview beyond America. Having not grown up in the States, I consider that I have a more expansive aperture to my worldview than comes naturally to most people born there. When I was considering what to do next, post-government, with my life and career, I initially wanted to join the British military. I started reading books about it, about the founding of special forces units, about their recruitment processes, and I got in shape. Being a newcomer to that world, I went out to California and I did some training with former Navy SEALs. And I had a long-term aspiration of joining Britain's special forces. But I'm a great adherent to the late Charlie Munger's iron prescription. I'm not entitled to have an opinion on any subject unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people who are supporting it. Only when I've reached that state am I qualified to speak. So while training physically, I began to read lots of material challenging the West's foreign policy. I watched Ken Burns' epic documentary series on the Vietnam War. I read some Seymour Hersh. I listened to the likes of Ben Griffin, a former British SAS soldier who bravely left the forces to become an outspoken critic of Western interventionism at the expense of becoming persona non grata at the base of his once brothers in arms. And I realized a lot of what these people are saying has merit to it. I want the protection of the West and our allies. But it dawned on me that the gravest deficiency we in the West have today is not to do with our military. It's diplomatic. There are grave challenges the West currently faces in its defence readiness, to be sure. This is especially notable in NATO's inability to manufacture artillery at nearly the rate of Russia, despite the notable difference in nominal GDPs. But there has been an even more glaring atrophying of our diplomatic capabilities. And the disproportionate amount of taxpayer money and intellectual firepower going into engineering and weaponry, Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, versus diplomacy is immense. While the job to be done, to use the Harvard Business School term, the objective being performed by both, is often actually similar. This was hammered home to me in a remarkable story told by Dean Stott, a former member of the SBS, which is the naval sibling of the SAS here in the UK. Given the task of evacuating the Canadian embassy in Tripoli during the Arab Spring, Dean, a cunning Brit with almost no budgets as a private security figure, single-handedly evacuated the embassy.
I don't go with the big overt vehicles. I like local taxis, just keep it all low profile. And the week before, the British got engaged at every checkpoint on the way to Tunis, which was obviously worrying the Canadians. So me and my fixer, we went out and we just, rather than speaking to the guys who got the weapons, identified who the tribal elders was, sat down with them, shared bread, shared coffee. And it was actually all about communication, showing them respect. And the following day, they then escorted us safely. So I got 18 military and 4 diplomats single-handedly from Tripoli to Tunis. To which his interviewer, former US Navy SEAL Jocko Willink, noted.
Yeah, just to put that in perspective a little bit, when I was a young SEAL before September 11th, one of the main missions, I did 2 deployments with the Marine Corps on ships, and one of the main missions that we would train for is called a NEO, non-combatant evacuation operation, which is literally to go into whatever, an American embassy, presumably, and go in some hostile or semi-hostile country and evacuate those people. But they would have an entire amphibious ready group with, several battalions of Marines, the air support, the SEALs, all to go and get whatever that group is out of the country. So when I was reading that portion of the book where you made this happen, that's a huge deal to do this. Essentially a mission that normally that could utilize an entire amphibious ready group with airframes and ships and the whole 9 yards to make this happen, and you were able to do it from a different angle by utilizing the locals, by building relationships with the locals, going and doing it low profile. That's just it's a real credit to the way you were thinking about that operation.
Can we encourage more such intelligent precision thinking at scale? I welcome and readily support attempts by companies like Anduril to rejuvenate military tech and Western defense procurement processes. Just, we need to be rejuvenating our diplomatic capabilities in lockstep. A part of me would still like to join the military as a reservist at some point. I'm still young enough to say that credibly. And I consider many world leaders we have in power today are of a notably inferior caliber to those of 50 years ago. And I assert that this is partly symptomatic of Western countries getting rid of mandatory service in the 60s and 70s, and the vast majority of today's leaders not having gone through such a process or having any military grounding. This is in stark contrast to notably well-run countries like Singapore and Switzerland. But we need a more intelligent framework for our foreign policy before I would ever wish to set foot in another military recruiter's office. The proposition that I'm putting forward, a new institution called Listening to the Other Side, is not to be a think tank. That's far too passive. Rather, an action tank. We would not be content with mere publication of papers. We would strive to craft actual viable solutions. We would fact check and hold to account influential traditional media when we consider they are being blind to the reality of facts on the ground. We would aim to provide such value to reasonable thinking government decision makers that instead of our having to lobby for our ideas, they would be actively solicited. Our focus area would be active conflicts and simmering points of global tension. We would not look at minor trade imbalances or low-level tariff disputes, but rather stopping active hot war. If this message speaks to you and you are potentially interested in supporting such an endeavour, there is an email box below. Please enter your email address and register your interest. And feel free to respond to the confirmation email and share any of your thoughts with me personally. As the .org URL should give away, this would be a not-for-profit. I'm going to spend the next 6 weeks following the publication of this video having as many conversations as I can with people of influence in this world, getting input, hearing where I might be wrong or mistaken, and getting further insight as to what could help make this the very best thing it could be. This video is a first draft. I'm taking an entrepreneur's ready, fire, aim approach to get something out. I don't know if anyone will actually care about this. I don't know if anyone will be willing to fund it. But this is my best attempt at laying out the beginnings of a plan that I believe is deserved of support. If I get sufficient interest and backing, I intend to build something and expand as swiftly as great people can be hired and balanced writers can be brought in to cover conflict areas while allowing for sufficient and robust quality assurance. I will leave you with a passage from 1966 and Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother. For the fortunate among us, there is the temptation to follow the easy and familiar paths of personal ambition and financial success so grandly spread. But that is not the road that history has marked out for us. Like it or not, we live in times of danger and uncertainty. All of us will ultimately be judged, and as the years pass, we will surely judge ourselves on the effort we have contributed to building a new world society, and the extent to which our ideals and goals have shaped that effort. Today, we need such a new world society. I consider the idea for a new Council on Foreign Relations for a multipolar world could be a meaningful contribution to it. I ask for your support and backing in this attempt. Thank you very much for watching. And for anybody wondering about the origami crane, I hired a research assistant based in Singapore in 2019, and she sent me this one year for Chinese New Year. Noting that the crane is a symbol of happiness, and in Japan it symbolizes good fortune and longevity. A hero of mine in publishing, Henry Luce, part hero, part cautionary tale, commenced his second publishing venture, age 31, called Fortune, Fortune magazine. My favorite TV show as a teenager was Prison Break, and anyone who has watched Prison Break will know that origami cranes are key to communication in taking on some of the darker elements of the US establishment in the show's plot. And I've read subsequently that origami cranes came to represent peace in Japan after World War II in Hiroshima. There was a young girl who had leukemia, and this was something she put out in the world in the hopes of advocating for peace. And I think origami itself is an intricate, layered web of other sides. So what could be a better symbol for our endeavor?